July 26, 1981. A Sunday afternoon in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. Benjamin Ruggiero, Lefty to everyone who knows him, is sitting in his apartment when the phone rings. The voice on the other end belongs to another Bonanno family member, and the message is short. Come to the social club. Right now? Lefty knows what this kind of summons means. He has been inside La Cosa Nostra for over 30 years. He understands the grammar of these moments, the flat tone, the absence of explanation, the urgency that leaves no room for delay. He turns to his wife and tells her that if he is not back by a certain time, it means they are going to kill him. Then he walks out the door. FBI agents watching his building arrest him on the sidewalk before he reaches his car. They may have saved his life. But what Lefty Ruggiero does not yet know, what the entire Bonanno crime family is only now beginning to understand, is that the man who has been standing beside him for nearly 6 years, the man he personally vouched for, trained, and brought into the deepest corridors of organized crime in New York, was never who he claimed to be. Donnie Brasco, jewel thief, earner, trusted associate of the Bonanno family, does not exist. He never did. To understand how an FBI agent penetrated one of the 5 families of the American Mafia deeper than any law enforcement officer in history, you have to go back 5 years to a version of New York that no longer exists. In the autumn of 1976, the streets of Lower Manhattan still belonged to an older order. Little Italy had not yet been reduced to a 3-block tourist corridor along Mulberry Street. The social clubs south of Houston still operated behind unmarked doors. Espresso bars on Mott Street served men who sat for hours without ordering twice. This was the last functioning territory of the old Sicilian power structure in Manhattan, compressed, decaying, but still governed by rules that had nothing to do with city law. The Bonanno family, one of the original 5 families established during the reorganization of the American Mafia in 1931, maintained a significant presence in these blocks, running gambling operations, loan sharking networks, and hijacking crews through soldiers and associates who had worked these streets for decades. Into this world walked a man calling himself Donnie Brasco. He was 37, wearing leather jackets and gold jewelry, speaking with the precise rhythm and vocabulary of someone who had spent his life around stolen merchandise and cash transactions that existed entirely outside the banking system. He told people he was a jewel thief from California, a connected guy looking to establish himself in New York. He could appraise a stolen diamond with enough expertise to convince anyone watching. He could discuss alarm bypasses, fencing networks, and the logistics of cross-country burglary operations with the casual specificity of a man who had done this work for years. His real name was Joseph Pistone. He was a special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, born in Erie, Pennsylvania, raised in Paterson, New Jersey, in an Italian-American community where the presence of organized crime was not exotic but ordinary, a permanent feature of the neighborhood landscape. He had joined the Bureau in 1969, worked undercover operations targeting truck hijacking and stolen property rings, and demonstrated an unusual aptitude for sustained deception in high-pressure environments. By the mid-1970s, the FBI had identified him as the ideal candidate for something that had never been seriously attempted: the long-term insertion of an undercover agent directly inside a New York Mafia family, not as a peripheral informant feeding intelligence from the edges, but as an embedded participant operating within the structure itself. The strategy departed from everything the Bureau had previously tried. Traditional Mafia investigations relied on turning existing members, men already inside the organization who could be pressured or bribed into cooperating. What the FBI was now proposing was the inverse: building a fictional identity so convincing that the Mafia itself would absorb it, protect it, and eventually trust it with operational intelligence that no informant had ever been positioned to access. It was an enormous gamble. If Pistone were discovered, there would be no rescue operation, no negotiation, no diplomatic extraction. He would simply disappear. The early months were slow, methodical work, frequenting known mob bars and after-hours clubs across Manhattan and Brooklyn, playing the role of a small-time jewel dealer, buying rounds, listening far more than speaking, and waiting for the organic moment when someone connected decided he was worth knowing. That connection came initially through Anthony Mira, a Bonanno family soldier operating out of Little Italy, a volatile, dangerous man with a reputation for paranoid violence. Mira introduced Brasco to his circle, but the relationship was unstable. Mira was erratic and territorial, qualities that made him a poor long-term anchor for an undercover operation that required consistency and predictable access. The operation found its true center of gravity when Pistone was gradually absorbed into the orbit of Benjamin Ruggiero. Lefty was a lifelong Bonanno soldier, formally inducted decades earlier, who had spent his entire adult life inside the machinery of organized crime without ever rising above the rank of soldier. He was not unintelligent, but he was perpetually unlucky, a heavy gambler who owed money constantly, a loyal operative who watched less devoted men promoted above him, a man carrying the accumulated bitterness of someone who believed the system he had given everything to had never adequately repaid his devotion. Lefty took Donnie Brasco under his wing as his protege and, in the formal language of the organization, became his sponsor. The made member who vouched for an associate took responsibility for his conduct and received a percentage of whatever the associate earned. For Lefty, Brasco was a solution to multiple problems: a competent earner who could generate income, a capable operator who enhanced his standing within the crew, and perhaps the leverage he needed to finally advance inside the family hierarchy. For Pistone, Lefty was something far more extraordinary: an authentic, fully initiated member of a New York crime family willing to bring an outsider directly into the daily mechanics of the Bonanno organization, introduce him to other made members, and explain, with the exhaustive detail of a man who had lived inside the system for 3 decades, exactly how every layer of La Cosa Nostra actually functioned. The intelligence Pistone began generating was unlike anything in FBI history. Lefty walked him through the complete architecture: the boss, underboss, consigliere, the capos running individual crews, the soldiers reporting upward, the associates operating beneath. He explained the financial tributaries, the rules governing disputes between families, the protocols for sit-downs, and the official prohibitions, particularly the ban on narcotics trafficking, which was the most discussed and most universally ignored rule in the entire organization. He explained, with the matter-of-fact authority of a survivor, what happened to men who betrayed the family's trust. They vanished. Their names were erased. Pistone recorded nothing on site. No wires. No transmitters. Nothing that could be discovered during the constant casual physical contact of mob social life. Instead, he maintained an exhausting discipline of mental documentation, retreating to secure locations to compile detailed written reports for his FBI handler, Supervisor Jules Bonavolanta, who managed the operation through the thinnest possible chain of communication to minimize the chance of exposure. By late 1978, Donnie Brasco was no longer a stranger on the periphery. He was Lefty's guy. He was known across the Bonanno Street crews. He was trusted, and the FBI operation that had started as an experimental probe was becoming something far larger, far more dangerous, and far more difficult to control than anyone had originally imagined. What transformed the Donnie Brasco operation from an extraordinary intelligence-gathering exercise into something genuinely unprecedented was not just Pistone's skill as an undercover agent. It was the timing. Because as Brasco was settling deeper into the Bonanno family's street-level operations, the family itself was tearing apart from the inside, and the chaos of that internal war would open doors that no amount of careful infiltration could have unlocked under normal circumstances. The Bonanno family had been unstable for over a decade. The roots of the dysfunction traced back to the early 1960s, when boss Joseph Bonanno, the family's namesake and one of the original architects of the commission system established in 1931, attempted to orchestrate the assassinations of rival bosses Carlo Gambino and Stefano Megadino in a power grab that would have made him the dominant force in the American Mafia. The plot was discovered. The commission intervened. Bonanno was eventually forced into retirement in 1968, and the family he left behind fractured into competing factions that spent the next decade fighting over the wreckage. By the mid-1970s, the Bonannos had been so weakened by internal conflict, federal prosecutions, and leadership instability that the other 4 families viewed them with something between contempt and concern. The family that had once been a pillar of the New York Mafia establishment was now considered unreliable, disorganized, and potentially dangerous to the broader interests of La Cosa Nostra. Into this vacuum stepped Philip Rostelli. Known as Rusty, Rostelli had maneuvered himself into the position of official boss by the mid-1970s, but his authority was immediately compromised by the fact that he was serving a federal prison sentence for extortion. A boss behind bars is a boss who governs through intermediaries, and intermediaries create opportunities for ambitious men to accumulate power of their own. The man who seized that opportunity most aggressively was Alphonse Indelicato, known on the street as Sonny Red, a capo who, along with allies Dominic Trinchera and Philip Giacone, began positioning himself as a rival power center within the family. The Bonannos were splitting into two camps, those loyal to the imprisoned Rostelli and those gravitating towards Sonny Red's faction, which openly questioned whether Rostelli's incarceration had rendered him incapable of leading. This is the environment Donnie Brasco was now operating inside, and the man who would become his most important connection, more important even than Lefty, was about to step into the center of the conflict. Dominic Napolitano ran a crew out of a social club on Madison Street in Lower Manhattan. Everyone called him Sonny Black, a reference to his jet black hair. He was a capo in the Bonanno family, a rank above soldiers like Lefty, carrying authority over his own crew and answering directly to the family administration. Sonny Black was everything Lefty was not: ambitious, calculating, politically astute within the internal dynamics of the organization, and possessed of a charisma that drew loyalty from the men around him. He was also a committed earner who understood that power within the mafia was ultimately a function of money, the ability to generate it, distribute it upward, and use it to build alliances. When Sonny Black encountered Donnie Brasco through Lefty's crew, he recognized what he believed was a serious operator, someone with skills, connections, and the temperament to contribute at a higher level than the petty gambling and loan sharking that occupied most of Lefty's time. What followed was a gradual but unmistakable shift. Brasco began spending more time in Sonny Black's orbit, participating in operations that carried greater scope and greater risk. For Pistone, this was an intelligence windfall. Access to a capo meant access to family politics, strategic decisions, and the kind of high-level criminal planning that soldiers like Lefty were never fully briefed on. For Lefty, it was a humiliation. In the rigid hierarchy of La Cosa Nostra, an associate technically belonged to the soldier who had sponsored him. But when a capo expressed interest in absorbing that associate into his own crew, the soldier had very little practical recourse. Lefty seethed, complained, and ultimately accepted what he could not change. Brasco was moving up, and Lefty, as always, was being left behind. The internal war reached its climax in the spring of 1981. On May 5th, Sonny Red, Trinchera, and Giacone were summoned to a meeting at a social club in Brooklyn, a sit-down ostensibly arranged to negotiate peace between the rival factions. It was a trap. Gunmen loyal to Rostelli's faction, operating under the coordination of loyalist capos, including Sonny Black and Joseph Pistone, were waiting inside. All three men were shot and killed. The bodies of Trinchera and Giacone were eventually recovered, buried in a vacant lot in Ozone Park, Queens. Indelicato's body was found separately. The triple murder eliminated the insurgent faction in a single stroke and consolidated Rostelli's control over the family, even from behind prison walls. Donnie Brasco was not present at the killings, but he was close enough to the aftermath to understand exactly what had happened and, more critically, why. Pistone's reports to the FBI during this period provided an unprecedented window into the mechanics of an internal mafia war, not the mythologized version told in movies, but the grinding, pragmatic reality of how factions within a crime family identified threats, built coalitions, and executed rivals with the bureaucratic efficiency of a hostile corporate takeover conducted with firearms. Sonny Black emerged from the massacre with dramatically elevated status. He was now one of the most powerful capos in the Bonanno family, a loyalist who had proven his value during the most dangerous internal crisis the organization had faced in years. And Donnie Brasco, as a trusted member of Sonny Black's crew, rose with him. Pistone was now operating at a level of access that no undercover agent, and arguably no informant, had ever achieved inside a New York crime family. He attended meetings where family business was discussed openly. He was privy to conversations about narcotics trafficking, labor racketeering, and the political relationships between the Bonannos and the other four families. There were discussions about eventually proposing Brasco for formal induction, making him a fully initiated member of La Cosa Nostra. This was the moment the FBI began to panic. The possibility that Pistone might actually be proposed for membership created a crisis within the Bureau that had no precedent and no established protocol. Making a man required a ceremony, the pricking of a finger, the burning of a saint's image, the oath of loyalty unto death. It also required, in most cases, the commission of serious crimes to demonstrate commitment. An FBI agent could not be inducted into the Mafia. The legal, ethical, and operational implications were staggering. But pulling Pistone out prematurely risked destroying years of intelligence gathering and potentially triggering violence against anyone who had been close to Brasco if the family began investigating his sudden disappearance. There was another concern, one the Bureau discussed internally but never articulated publicly with much clarity. After nearly 6 years of living as Donnie Brasco, there were supervisors within the FBI who questioned whether Pistone still knew exactly where the line was. He had spent more time with Lefty Ruggiero and Sonny Black than he had with his own family. His marriage was fracturing under the pressure of prolonged absences and the inability to explain where he was or what he was doing. He had adopted the mannerisms, the rhythms, and the worldview of the men he was deceiving so completely that some handlers worried the performance had begun to merge with reality. Pistone would later deny this categorically, insisting that he never lost sight of his mission or his identity. But the fact that the question was asked at all, inside the FBI, among men who had supervised the operation from its inception, reveals just how deep into the underworld Donnie Brasco had gone. By the summer of 1981, the FBI made its decision. The operation would end. Pistone would be extracted. And the Bonanno crime family was about to learn that the most trusted associate in Sonny Black's crew had been recording their destruction from the inside for 6 years. The extraction was not a single dramatic moment. It was a controlled disappearance, engineered over several weeks in the summer of 1981 to minimize immediate suspicion while the FBI prepared the legal machinery that would convert 6 years of intelligence into federal indictments. Pistone began pulling back from daily contact with Sonny Black's crew, missing meetings, offering vague explanations about business obligations elsewhere, creating the kind of gradual absence that might plausibly be interpreted as a man dealing with personal problems or pursuing opportunities in another city. The goal was to buy time. Every additional day before the Bonannos realized what had happened was a day the Bureau could use to secure warrants, coordinate arrests, and ensure the safety of agents and cooperating witnesses who might be exposed once the truth detonated inside the family. But the Mafia is an organization built on suspicion, and absence, in that world, is never interpreted innocently for long. The first tremors came through the network of relationships that Pistone had spent years constructing. When Donnie Brasco stopped appearing at the social club on Madison Street, Sonny Black noticed. When phone calls went unanswered, Lefty noticed. When inquiries through mutual associates produced no satisfactory explanation for where Brasco had gone or what he was doing, the paranoia that is the immune system of organized crime began activating. Something was wrong. The men who had vouched for Donnie Brasco, who had staked their reputations and, in the unforgiving arithmetic of La Cosa Nostra, their lives on his authenticity, began asking questions that had no comfortable answers. The confirmation came in late July 1981. The precise mechanism by which the Bonanno family learned the truth has been described in varying accounts, but the essential facts are consistent. Word reached the family leadership that Donnie Brasco was a federal agent, that the man who had sat in their social clubs, handled their money, participated in their operations, and earned the trust of a capo and a soldier over the course of 6 years had been working for the FBI the entire time. The information did not arrive as rumor or speculation. It arrived with the force of certainty, the kind of certainty that transforms confusion into rage and rage into the cold, procedural violence that the Mafia reserves for its most fundamental category of threat. The reaction inside the Bonanno family was immediate and savage in its implications. In the hierarchy of offenses recognized by La Cosa Nostra, there is nothing that surpasses the introduction of a law enforcement agent into the organization. It is not merely a failure of judgment. It is an existential breach, a violation so profound that it calls into question the competence, the loyalty, and ultimately the right to continued existence of every person in the chain of trust that allowed the infiltration to occur. The men who had sponsored Donnie Brasco, who had vouched for him, who had brought him into rooms where family business was discussed openly, those men were now standing in the most dangerous position a member of the mafia can occupy. They were responsible. Lefty Ruggiero understood this instantly. He had been inside the organization long enough to know exactly what the protocols demanded. The man who introduces an informant, or, in this case, an undercover agent, into a mafia family bears personal responsibility for that betrayal, regardless of whether the introduction was made in good faith. Ignorance is not a defense. Lefty had brought Brasco in. He had vouched for him. He had trained him, explained the rules to him, introduced him to made members across multiple crews. Under the ancient logic of the organization, Lefty's life was now forfeit. Not as punishment for deliberate treachery, but as consequence. The inevitable, mechanical result of a system in which trust is guaranteed by the implicit threat of death for its violation. This is why, on that Sunday afternoon in Bay Ridge, when the phone rang and the voice on the other end told him to come to the club immediately, Lefty Ruggiero understood what was waiting for him. He dressed, told his wife what he believed was about to happen, and walked out of his apartment to meet whatever judgment the family had prepared. The FBI agents who intercepted him on the sidewalk did not arrest him out of routine procedure. They arrested him because they knew, with reasonable certainty, that Benjamin Ruggiero was walking toward his own execution. Sonny Black's situation was different in degree, but identical in kind. As the capo who had absorbed Brasco into his crew, elevated him within the organization, and allowed him access to the highest levels of family business during the most sensitive period in the Bonanno's recent history. The internal war, the triple murder of the rival faction, the consolidation of Rostelli's power, Napolitano bore an even greater burden of responsibility. He had not merely vouched for an FBI agent. He had empowered one. He had given a federal operative a front-row seat to an internal mafia assassination that resulted in 3 deaths, and he had done so while believing he was rewarding a loyal associate for his competence and commitment. In the days following the revelation, Sonny Black appeared to recognize the inevitability of what was coming. According to accounts from associates who interacted with him during this period, he did not attempt to flee. He did not go into hiding. He did not reach out to law enforcement to negotiate cooperation. Instead, he engaged in what can only be described as the behavior of a man putting his affairs in order. He reportedly gave his jewelry and personal effects to associates, entrusted his pet pigeons to the care of a friend, and prepared himself for a summons he knew would arrive. In the world Sonny Black inhabited, there was no appeal, no court of review, no possibility of arguing that his mistake had been honest rather than deliberate. The system did not distinguish between treachery and incompetence. Both were fatal. On August 17, 1981, Dominic Napolitano was called to a meeting. He went. He did not return. His body was not discovered until over a year later, when construction workers found his remains in a creek bed on Staten Island. His hands had been severed, a symbolic gesture within mafia tradition indicating that the victim had committed an act considered unforgivable, specifically the introduction of an outsider who had damaged the family. The mutilation was not random violence. It was a message, encoded in the grammar of ritual punishment that La Cosa Nostra had maintained for generations. Meanwhile, the FBI moved with the accumulated momentum of 6 years of intelligence. Arrest warrants were executed across New York and New Jersey. Members of the Bonanno family and associated criminal networks were taken into custody in coordinated operations designed to prevent the destruction of evidence or the flight of high-value targets. The indictments that followed drew directly from the detailed reports Pistone had compiled throughout the operation: names, dates, locations, criminal activities, and the internal political dynamics of the Bonanno organization documented with a precision that no informant testimony had ever matched. The scope of the intelligence was staggering. Pistone had not merely gathered evidence of individual crimes. He had mapped the operating system of a New York Mafia family from the inside, producing a comprehensive portrait of how La Cosa Nostra actually functioned at every level, from street corner loan sharking to commission-level politics. The Bonanno family reeled. In the immediate aftermath of the Brasco revelation, the Commission, the governing body of the 5 families, took the extraordinary step of expelling the Bonannos from its membership. This was not merely a symbolic rebuke. Commission membership conferred legitimacy, protection, and the right to participate in the adjudication of inter-family disputes and the division of criminal territories. Losing that seat meant losing the political infrastructure that allowed a family to operate as a co-equal partner in the New York Mafia ecosystem. The Bonannos were, in effect, demoted, stripped of their standing, and left to rebuild their credibility from a position of disgrace. The expulsion would last several years, and the stigma of having been infiltrated so deeply by a federal agent would shadow the family for decades. The trials that followed dismantled what remained of the Bonanno family's operational infrastructure with methodical precision. Joseph Pistone emerged from the shadow world of Donnie Brasco and stepped into federal courtrooms as the most consequential witness in the history of organized crime prosecution. His testimony was not the testimony of a turned mobster bargaining for leniency, a figure whose credibility defense attorneys could attack on grounds of self-interest, criminal history, or personal vendetta. Pistone was a federal agent. He had no criminal record. He had no plea agreement. He had no motive to fabricate or embellish. He had spent 6 years inside the Bonanno family compiling intelligence with the disciplined methodology of a trained investigator, and the documentation he produced was extensive, consistent, and devastating. The first major prosecution targeted Benjamin Ruggiero. Lefty was charged under the RICO statutes, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act that had been enacted in 1970 but had spent the better part of a decade as an underutilized legal instrument before prosecutors began recognizing its extraordinary potential as a weapon against organized crime. RICO allowed the government to prosecute membership in a criminal enterprise as a crime in itself, connecting individual acts of racketeering, gambling, loan sharking, extortion, narcotics trafficking, into a single pattern of organized criminal behavior. The intelligence Pistone had gathered provided exactly the kind of comprehensive, structurally detailed evidence that RICO prosecutions required. It was not enough to prove that Lefty Ruggiero had committed specific crimes. The evidence demonstrated that he was a functioning component of a criminal organization, that his crimes were not isolated acts but expressions of his role within a system designed to generate profit through sustained illegal activity. Lefty went to trial and was convicted. He received a sentence of 20 years. For a man in his 60s who had spent his entire life inside the mafia and had nothing waiting for him outside it, the sentence was effectively terminal. Lefty would spend the remainder of his functional years in federal custody, stripped of the only identity he had ever possessed, that of a made member of the Bonanno crime family. The final irony was bitter and complete. Lefty had devoted 30 years to an organization that had never promoted him, never adequately compensated him, and never recognized his loyalty with the advancement he believed he deserved. And in the end, the organization repaid that loyalty by preparing to murder him for a mistake he had made in good faith, vouching for a man who had deceived him with a level of skill that no one in the Bonanno family had ever encountered or been equipped to detect. Anthony Mira, the volatile soldier who had first introduced Pistone to the Bonanno world before Lefty absorbed him into his own orbit, did not survive long enough to face federal prosecution. Mira understood that the chain of responsibility for the Brasco infiltration extended backward to the first point of contact, and that first point of contact was him. In February 1982, Mira was found dead in a parking garage in Lower Manhattan, shot multiple times. The killing was widely attributed to internal Bonanno enforcement, the family eliminating another link in the chain of failure that had allowed an FBI agent to operate inside the organization for 6 years. Mira's murder, like Sonny Black's, was not an act of revenge in the emotional sense. It was maintenance, the systematic removal of compromised nodes from a network that could not afford to retain anyone associated with the catastrophe. The prosecutions extended far beyond Lefty and the immediate circle of men who had interacted with Donnie Brasco. The intelligence Pistone had gathered over 6 years touched virtually every active operation the Bonanno family had been running during that period. Gambling networks, loan sharking operations, hijacking crews, labor racketeering schemes, and narcotics trafficking pipelines that the family's leadership officially prohibited but privately tolerated as long as the money flowed upward through the proper channels. Federal prosecutors used this intelligence to build cases that targeted not just soldiers and associates, but capos and members of the family administration, systematically dismantling the command structure that had governed the Bonanno's criminal operations for decades. The cumulative impact was staggering. Over 200 federal indictments were eventually connected, directly or indirectly, to intelligence generated during the Brasco operation. Convictions cascaded through the organization, removing experienced operators and replacing them with a vacuum that younger, less disciplined members would struggle to fill. The Bonanno family, already weakened by years of internal warfare and the disgrace of commission expulsion, was reduced to a shadow of its former capability, still functioning, still nominally one of the five families, but operating with diminished manpower, diminished credibility, and the permanent stigma of having been the family that let an FBI agent walk through its front door and sit in its living room for half a decade. The broader consequences rippled outward across the entire landscape of American organized crime. The Brasco operation demonstrated, for the first time, that La Cosa Nostra was not impenetrable. For generations, the Mafia had operated behind a wall of cultural insularity and enforced silence. The Code of Omerta, which held that cooperation with law enforcement was the ultimate betrayal, and that the internal affairs of the organization were invisible to outsiders by definition. The five families had survived decades of federal investigation, congressional hearings, and aggressive prosecution by maintaining the structural integrity of that wall. Informants had breached it periodically, most notably Joseph Pistone, whose 1963 testimony before a Senate committee had confirmed the existence and basic structure of La Cosa Nostra for the first time. But Pistone was a low-ranking soldier who had cooperated after being convicted, offering retrospective intelligence about an organization he was no longer part of. What Pistone had accomplished was categorically different. He had entered the organization from outside, operated within it in real time, and generated intelligence of a depth and specificity that made Pistone's revelations look like a rough pencil sketch compared to a detailed architectural blueprint. The psychological impact on the Mafia was profound and permanent. After Donnie Brasco, every crime family in America operated under a new and corrosive understanding that the man sitting across the table at the social club, the associate who had been vouched for by a trusted soldier, the earner who showed up reliably and never asked the wrong questions, might be a federal agent building a case that would destroy the family from within. This paranoia did not paralyze the Mafia. The five families continued to operate, generate revenue, and exercise influence over labor unions, construction industries, and political networks throughout the 1980s. But the paranoia changed the texture of daily operations. Trust became harder to establish. New associates faced longer periods of scrutiny. The casual confidence with which members had once discussed family business in social clubs and restaurants was eroded by the knowledge that the walls might not just have ears, they might have an FBI badge. Joseph Pistone himself entered a kind of permanent exile. A contract of $500,000 was placed on his life by the Bonanno family, a bounty that, according to federal authorities, was never formally rescinded. Pistone underwent plastic surgery, relocated his family multiple times, and spent the rest of his life operating under security protocols that effectively severed him from any stable version of normal existence. He had given 6 years to the most successful undercover operation in American law enforcement history, and the cost was a life spent looking over his shoulder in a country where the men he had betrayed possessed long memories and longer reach. He testified in numerous federal trials throughout the 1980s, each appearance reinforcing the devastating completeness of the intelligence he had gathered and the inescapable reality of what his operation had proven. The Bonanno family eventually regained its seat on the commission, rebuilt portions of its operational capability under the leadership of Joseph Pistone, the same loyalist capo who had helped orchestrate the 1981 triple murder during the internal war, and continued to function as a criminal enterprise into the 21st century. But the family never fully recovered from the Brasco wound. The infiltration had exposed not just the Bonanno's specific vulnerabilities, but the structural weakness of the entire system. The fundamental paradox of an organization that depended on trust between criminals in an environment where trust was the most dangerous commodity a man could trade in. What Pistone had proven, at enormous personal cost, was simple and irreversible. The Mafia was not a fortress. It was a structure built by men, governed by men, and vulnerable to the same human weaknesses: greed, loneliness, vanity, the desperate need to trust someone, that governed every other human institution. The myth of impenetrability, carefully maintained for half a century, died in the social clubs of Lower Manhattan, killed by a man who walked in wearing a leather jacket and gold chains, and walked out carrying 6 years of secrets that the Mafia believed no outsider would ever possess. Donnie Brasco did not exist, but what he destroyed was very real.